It all began with an ordinary request. That's what I keep telling myself. An ordinary request that led to a night I will never forget. It sounds silly now, the way I let one small, seemingly insignificant moment spiral into everything else, but you can't always control how life changes. Sometimes, it's like the ground shifts beneath your feet, and you don't even notice until you've fallen through the cracks. But let me start at the beginning. The night was supposed to be just a quiet evening at home. No fanfare, no drama. The kind of evening where you cook dinner, eat, watch something on TV, and call it a day. I'd gotten used to these nights, the calm after a week of work and stress. I was fine with it, comfortable even. Sure, maybe things weren't as exciting as they once were, but comfort was better than nothing. At least, that's what I thought. But as I prepared dinner, she came into the kitchen, a look on her face I hadn't seen in a while. It wasn't concern exactly. It was more like a flicker of something I couldn't place. She hesitated, as if she was deciding how to say something, and that was the first crack in the facade. "Hey, I was thinking we should invite some people over tonight," she said, her voice lighter than usual. I glanced over at her, wiping my hands on the towel. "People?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Yeah," she continued, "just a few people. Friends. It'll be nice. Nothing big." She smiled, but there was a subtle edge to her words. It felt off, like she was trying a little too hard to convince me. "Don't worry. It'll be fun." I paused, chewing on the inside of my cheek. We didn't usually host dinner parties. Not because we didn't have friends. We did, of course, but because, well, I wasn't good at it. I wasn't exactly the life of the party, you know? The thought of making small talk for hours made my skin crawl. But the way she said it, so casually, like it was no big deal, left me feeling like I didn't have much of a choice. "All right," I said, reluctantly. "Who's coming?" "A few of my old coworkers," she replied. "And maybe a friend from college. You know, just a small group." I wasn't thrilled, but I agreed. The evening unfolded like any other dinner party. The guests arrived, one by one, at the usual time. There was the usual round of hellos, the polite exchanges of pleasantries. I stood by the door, greeting everyone, trying to mask my unease. It was like a well-rehearsed dance. Beatrice took control, directing the flow of the night with ease. She moved through the space like she owned it, making everyone feel welcome, pulling them into the conversation without effort. It wasn't long before I noticed the dynamic shift. I had always considered myself a quiet person, but that night, it felt like I was invisible. Beatrice and her friends talked around me, their voices louder than mine, their laughter brighter. I did my best to keep up, contributing where I could, but somehow, it felt like I was on the outside looking in. Then it happened. I'm not sure exactly when the tension started building, but by the time dessert was served, it was palpable. It started with one of her friends, Melanie, joking about something I had said earlier. It was harmless enough at first, a laugh, a light-hearted comment. But then Beatrice jumped in. Her eyes gleamed, and she laughed just a little too hard at the joke, her hand resting on Melanie's arm. The touch lingered longer than it should have, and I noticed the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't a huge thing, but it made my chest tighten. I could feel the shift. Like there was something in the air that I wasn't supposed to see. Something beneath the surface that no one was talking about. And then, as if on cue, Beatrice looked at me and said, "I'm going to step outside for a minute. Catch some air." I nodded, unsure of what to say. It was normal for her to take breaks, to go outside for a while when things got a little too much for her. But this time felt different. This time, there was something in her expression. A flicker of something that made my stomach drop. "Okay," I said, swallowing. "I'll be here." She stood up and turned toward the door, but before she could walk out, Melanie leaned over to her and whispered something that I couldn't quite hear. It was soft, too quiet for the others to pick up, but the way Beatrice nodded and smiled in response made something stir deep inside me. The smile wasn't for me. It was for Melanie. It was like they shared a secret, something I wasn't a part of. And then they both left. Together. I didn't follow them. I couldn't bring myself to. It wasn't like me. Besides, the night had already turned awkward, and I didn't want to make things worse. So I stayed, sitting there at the table, trying to force a smile at the conversation that still continued around me. But my mind wasn't there. It wasn't in the room with the others. My thoughts were outside, with them. Something had changed. Something had shifted in the way Beatrice looked at me, in the way she acted. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was on the outside of my own marriage. That was when I realized this wasn't just an ordinary dinner. This wasn't just a random evening with friends. It was the start of something that was beyond my control, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I watched them walk out the door, Beatrice and Melanie, side by side, heading into the night. The laughter and chatter from the table behind me barely registered. My focus was fixed on them. I couldn't explain why it bothered me so much. It wasn't like Beatrice hadn't stepped outside before. She often did, to get some fresh air or just to clear her head. But tonight, it felt different. I wasn't sure if I was overthinking it, but the way Melanie had leaned in, the way Beatrice had looked at her, it was too intimate. It wasn't just a friendly gesture. There was something about it that made my heart race. The kind of unease that you can't shake, no matter how much you try to rationalize it. I stayed at the table, pretending to listen to the conversation around me. But all I could hear in my head was the sound of the door closing behind them. It felt like the room had grown smaller. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all seemed far away. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept wandering back to the way Beatrice had looked at me earlier, how she'd pulled away from me in ways that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just tonight. It was the little things that had been building up for months, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. The minutes dragged on. I tried to tell myself they were just stepping outside for a moment, but my gut told me otherwise. And when the door finally opened again, it wasn't Beatrice who came back inside. It was Melanie. She stepped in, looking a little flushed, like she'd been caught off guard. She didn't meet my eyes as she crossed the room. I cleared my throat, trying to break the tension that had settled in my chest. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice a little too strained. Melanie gave me a tight smile. "Yeah, just needed a bit of air," she said, not offering much else. It wasn't convincing. Something was off about her tone. The way she avoided my gaze made me uneasy. "And Beatrice?" I asked before I could stop myself. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to sound too suspicious, but I couldn't help it. Melanie hesitated. For just a second, I thought she might say something else, something that would make everything make sense. But she just nodded and said, "She's fine. Just needed a minute, you know?" That didn't reassure me. It made my chest tighten even more. I forced a smile, trying to act casual, but I knew something had shifted. Something had changed in the last few minutes. The conversation at the table continued, but my mind wasn't with them. I kept looking at the door, wondering why Beatrice hadn't come back yet. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just reading too much into something small. But the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the stronger the feeling became. I felt like I was losing control of the situation. Then, just as I was about to stand up and go check on Beatrice, she walked back in, her eyes avoiding mine. She didn't even greet me. She just moved to the other side of the room, joining the others at the table without a word. Her demeanor had shifted, and I could feel it in the air. Something was different. Something had happened outside. I wanted to ask her what was going on. I wanted to confront her, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to start a scene in front of everyone. I didn't want to look crazy or overreact. So, I stayed silent, trying to play the part of the husband who didn't notice anything wrong. But inside, my mind was racing. And I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The laughter and the conversations felt distant, like they were happening on the other side of a wall. I felt disconnected from everything, from Beatrice, from the friends around me. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. And as the night dragged on, I realized one painful truth. I wasn't part of this anymore. Something had changed. Something had shifted, and I was just waiting for the next piece to fall. The next few hours felt like they were happening in slow motion. I tried to keep myself occupied, to smile, to laugh when appropriate. But inside, I was a mess. Every glance at Beatrice, every moment of silence between us, felt like a crack in the foundation of something I thought was solid. She hadn't said a word about stepping outside with Melanie. No explanation, no apology, nothing. It was as if it had never happened. But I knew it had. And the fact that she was acting like it was no big deal only made it worse. I caught her eye a few times across the room. There was a certain coldness there now, like she was looking at me through a fog. When she did speak, it was brief, curt. She didn't ask me how I was doing or what I thought about the evening. She just talked to the others. It wasn't like the Beatrice I knew, the one who used to ask how my day went, who would pull me into a conversation when I was zoning out. It was as if I were invisible. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, that maybe she was just tired. But the way she'd looked at me earlier, the way she'd brushed me off, it didn't sit right. I had a feeling that something bigger was going on, something I wasn't ready to face. It wasn't just about the way she'd acted tonight. It was everything that had been building up for months. Little moments I had ignored, dismissing them as part of the ebb and flow of life. But now, it felt like those moments were coming together, forming something I couldn't deny. I glanced around the room at her friends. They were all engaged in conversation, laughing, having a good time. But I felt completely disconnected from them. Even though we were all in the same space, I felt like I was in a completely different world. A world where my wife didn't seem to care about me the way she used to. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't know the last time Beatrice had really looked at me the way she used to. The way she used to see me, not just as a husband, but as someone she cared about. I missed that look. The warmth, the connection. It was like I was watching a stranger now. But the real question was, why? What had changed? Why had she been so distant tonight? And why had she left with Melanie, only to return as if nothing had happened? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That whatever was going on with her, whatever had shifted, was only going to get worse. As the evening wore on, I began to feel the weight of it all. It wasn't just a bad night anymore. It was the start of something. Something that was slipping out of my control. And no matter how much I tried to push the thought out of my mind, I knew it was coming. The truth. The truth that would change everything. The night stretched on, and I couldn't escape the growing sense of isolation. It was as if Beatrice and I were in two separate worlds, and nothing I did seemed to bridge the gap between us. The others didn't notice. No one did. They were all too caught up in their own conversations, their own lives. But I was there, stuck in this silent bubble, watching my marriage unravel right in front of me. Beatrice kept her distance. She didn't touch me the way she used to, didn't make that eye contact that made everything feel like it was just us in the room. Every time I tried to approach her, to start a conversation, she would either cut me off or redirect the focus to someone else. It wasn't overtly rude, but the subtlety was worse. It felt like she was pushing me away without saying a word. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront her? Ask her what was going on? Or was I just being paranoid, overthinking every little thing? I couldn't tell anymore. The more I tried to analyze her behavior, the more confused I became. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. I watched as she laughed with Derek, leaning in just a little too much, a little too comfortably. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too far into it. But deep down, something twisted inside me. It wasn't like Beatrice to be so distant, so unreachable. And then it happened. Melanie, who had been sitting quietly up until now, stood up and made her way to the kitchen. I didn't think much of it at first, but when she returned, she didn't just walk past me. She stopped, stood in front of me, her eyes meeting mine in a way that sent an unsettling shiver down my spine. "Hey, Julian," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile, but the tension in her gaze didn't go unnoticed. "Yeah, just tired. Long day, you know." She didn't seem convinced. "You sure? You've been a little off tonight." I wanted to brush it off, to tell her I was just overthinking things. But something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't sympathy, and it wasn't concern. It was almost like she was probing, like she knew something I didn't. "I'm fine," I repeated, this time more firmly. Melanie didn't push it any further, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at me differently. Almost like she was waiting for something to happen, like she was watching to see how I'd react. I couldn't get the image of her and Beatrice talking outside out of my head. The way they had whispered to each other. The way Melanie had looked at me when she came back inside. As the night continued, I felt the walls closing in on me. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, it all felt distant. Everything felt distant. It was as though I was a ghost in my own life, unable to reach out, unable to connect. Beatrice was there, but she wasn't there with me. She was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't follow. And as I sat there, I realized something terrifying. Beatrice was changing, and I didn't know if I could catch up. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere in the middle of the evening, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Small things, tiny cracks that I had been too blind to see. At some point, I realized I wasn't just sitting at the table. I wasn't just a passive observer. I was being ignored. Beatrice wasn't looking at me the same way, and I wasn't imagining it. The way her eyes would flicker past me when I spoke, like she was listening but not really hearing, was becoming impossible to ignore. I'd ask her something, and she'd nod, half-heartedly, then turn her attention back to Derek or Melanie. At first, I thought it was nothing. Maybe I was just overreacting. But then, as the night wore on, it happened again. And again, she would laugh at things I said, but there was no warmth in her laugh. It was more like she was laughing at me, not with me. I sat there, trying to keep my face neutral, while the room spun around me. Beatrice wasn't the same person she had been when we first met, when we used to talk for hours about everything and nothing. Now, she barely seemed interested in the person sitting across from her, the person she had once promised to share her life with. There was one moment, though, when everything changed. It wasn't a huge thing. It was a look. Just a simple, fleeting look, but it sent a chill down my spine. Beatrice was talking to Melanie again, and I wasn't part of the conversation. I was sitting there, watching them, when she turned and glanced at me. It was so quick, I almost missed it. But when our eyes met, something shifted. It wasn't a look of affection or even curiosity. It was more like a look of resignation, as if she had already made up her mind about something and was just waiting for the rest of it to play out. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't understand why, but that look, something about it, made me feel like I had already lost her. Like she was seeing me, but not really seeing me. I wanted to ask her what was going on, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't know what to say anymore. The tension in the room was unbearable. The conversations continued, but they all felt so distant, so irrelevant. It was like I was living in some parallel version of this night, one where I wasn't really part of what was happening. Beatrice and Melanie excused themselves to go outside again, and for the first time, I didn't follow them. I stayed seated, watching the door close behind them. I didn't even bother pretending to be engaged in the conversation. My thoughts were too loud. They were all consumed with one question. What was happening? What was Beatrice not telling me? I didn't know if I was ready to hear the answer, but I was pretty sure I wasn't going to like it. The minutes that passed after Beatrice and Melanie left felt endless. The silence in the room was almost suffocating. The others were still chatting away, but I couldn't bring myself to join in. My thoughts were elsewhere, replaying everything that had happened up to that point. My stomach was a mess, and my heart kept pounding like I was about to face something I wasn't prepared for. I kept trying to focus on the noise around me, to convince myself that I was being paranoid. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just reading too much into the small things. But then, I kept going back to that look, the one Beatrice had given me just moments before she stepped outside with Melanie. The way her eyes had shifted, the way she had almost seemed detached. The minutes dragged on like hours. I kept telling myself they'd be back soon, that this was just a break, a quick conversation outside. But my gut told me otherwise. Something had changed. And whatever it wasn't something I was going to be able to ignore. Finally, the door opened again. I looked up, expecting to see Beatrice, but it was Melanie who walked in first. She had a strange, almost unreadable expression on her face. She didn't say anything at first, but her eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine. I didn't know if I should speak up or just let it be. I didn't know what she knew or what she wasn't saying. I cleared my throat. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice betraying the anxiety that was swirling inside me. Melanie paused, her gaze flicking to the door where Beatrice had just disappeared. She seemed like she was struggling to find the right words, and that was enough to make my heart drop. "Yeah," she said finally, her voice low. "Everything's fine." But I didn't believe her. I could hear it in her tone, the hesitation, the way she avoided eye contact. I knew something had happened out there, something that had left both of them changed, and I wasn't part of it. "Where's Beatrice?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. Melanie hesitated again before answering. "She's just taking a moment. She'll be back in a bit." But even as she said it, I could tell she wasn't telling the whole truth. There was something more behind her words, something that didn't quite add up. "I think I should go check on her," I said, standing up before I could stop myself. I couldn't sit there any longer, pretending like everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. Melanie's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I thought she was going to stop me. But instead, she just nodded, her lips tight. "Yeah, maybe you should." I walked toward the door, my pulse quickening. I had to know what was going on. I had to hear it from Beatrice herself. Whatever was happening, I couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. As I stepped outside, The cool night air hit me, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside my chest. The garden was quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of cars passing by and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I looked around, but I couldn't see Beatrice or Melanie anywhere. I called out, a little louder than I meant to. Beatrice. There was no answer. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach as I walked further into the yard, my footsteps crunching against the gravel. I rounded the corner of the house, and that's when I saw them. Beatrice and Melanie were standing by the old wooden fence, facing each other. They were talking in hushed tones, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could see it in their body language. They were too close, too comfortable, as if there was something more between them than just a conversation. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart pounded in my chest. What was going on? Why hadn't Beatrice told me about this? Why was she keeping me in the dark? And then, just as I was about to step forward, I saw it. Beatrice reached out and touched Melanie's arm. The way she did it, so naturally, so casually, sent a chill down my spine. It was the kind of touch that wasn't just friendly. It was intimate. That was the moment everything changed. The moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with distance in my marriage. I was dealing with something far worse. I froze, my body rigid, as I watched them. Beatrice's hand still rested on Melanie's arm. The touch lingered, soft and unhurried, like they were two people who didn't need to say anything to understand each other. But I wasn't part of it. I was on the outside, looking in, trying to make sense of something that was beginning to feel like a nightmare. I wanted to step forward. I wanted to demand answers right there, to confront them both. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the sheer weight of the moment, but I couldn't bring myself to interrupt them. The quiet that hung between them was louder than anything I could have said. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing in my chest. Beatrice hadn't seen me yet. She was still focused on Melanie, her gaze soft, like she was listening to something that only she could hear. And Melanie, her expression was unreadable, but I could tell that whatever was going on between them, it wasn't innocent. Then, without warning, Beatrice turned her head slightly. Her eyes flicked over to me, and in that split second, I saw it. The guilt, the confusion, the something she hadn't told me. I wanted to say something, to ask her what was happening, why she hadn't told me about this connection between her and Melanie. But the words wouldn't come. I was frozen in place, caught in the moment, as if speaking would somehow shatter whatever fragile control I still had. Beatrice took a deep breath and pulled her hand back from Melanie's arm. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to tell me that whatever had been there, whatever had happened, wasn't something she was ready to explain. Not yet. I turned on my heel, walking away before I could see more. I couldn't handle it. Not right now. My mind was racing, a storm of thoughts crashing into each other. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew I couldn't unsee it. I went back inside the house, my hands shaking, my heart still pounding. The others were still talking, oblivious to what had just happened outside. But I wasn't listening. I couldn't. Beatrice walked in a few moments later, as if nothing had happened. She smiled at the group, trying to act normal, but I saw through it. She was hiding something. Hiding everything. The distance between us was now more than just emotional. It was physical, palpable, like a wall had gone up between us that I couldn't break down. I kept my distance, not sure if I even wanted to know the truth anymore. But deep down, I knew I couldn't go on pretending. Whatever was happening, whatever I had just seen, was only the beginning, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The rest of the night felt like a blur. I stayed quiet, trying to hold it together, trying to act like everything was normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen too much, felt too much to keep pretending that my marriage was the same. I couldn't shake the image of Beatrice and Melanie, the way they had looked at each other. It haunted me, and I wasn't sure how to move forward. But then, around midnight, after the guests had left, Beatrice and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The house was eerily quiet now. The weight of everything that had happened hung between us like a thick fog. Neither of us spoke for a while. I could feel the tension, like we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, Beatrice spoke. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Julian, we need to talk." My heart skipped a beat, but I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming. I had no idea how this conversation would go, but I knew it had to happen. I've been distant, haven't I?" she said, looking down at her hands. "I didn't mean to shut you out. It's just that I've been feeling so lost lately. I've been uncertain about a lot of things. I felt a pang in my chest. This wasn't what I expected. I had thought the worst, but what I was hearing wasn't betrayal. It was fear and honesty. For the first time in a while, I saw vulnerability in Beatrice's eyes, something I hadn't seen in months. I noticed. I said quietly, my voice rough. But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling? She hesitated, then looked up at me, her eyes full of regret. I didn't want to burden you. I didn't want to make things harder. I thought maybe if I stayed distant, I could figure it out on my own. But I was wrong. I should have talked to you sooner. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. So, this, between you and Melanie, it's not what I thought. Beatrice's face flushed, and she shook her head. No, it wasn't like that. We've always been close, but that night, outside, I don't know. I've been so disconnected from everything. But it wasn't anything more than that. I swear. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Relief washed over me, though there was still a lingering unease. I had feared the worst, and in the end, it was just a breakdown. A breakdown of communication, of trust, of feeling lost in a relationship that once felt so secure. I don't want to lose you, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I don't want to be a stranger in our marriage. If something's wrong, I want to fix it. Together. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached out to take my hand. I don't want to lose you either. I'm so sorry, Julian. I never meant to hurt you. We sat there for a long while, our fingers intertwined, the quiet of the night settling around us. The storm that had been brewing between us was finally starting to subside. We had talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like forever. The walls that had been between us slowly began to come down. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There was still a lot we needed to work through, a lot of conversations to have. But for the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same team again. It wasn't perfect. We weren't perfect, but we were together. And maybe that was enough to start rebuilding. As Beatrice kissed me softly on the cheek, I realized something. Sometimes, you have to go through the storm to see the calm that follows. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something even stronger than before.